Hello, welcome back to FoodPrints. Today we're going to investigate composting, why it's important, and how you can do it. That's why today's lesson is called All About Compost. And I think the best way to start this lesson is to define some of the terms we'll be using. Let's start with this word decompose. When something decomposes, it breaks down into smaller parts. For example, when an old tree dies, it falls down in the woods, and it soon begins to decompose. That means it is slowly pulled apart and broken down into smaller pieces, so that its nutrients can eventually return to the soil. And now you might be wondering, who is responsible for that breaking down of that tree into smaller parts? Good question. And the answer is decomposers. Living in the soil are millions of organisms that break down or eat or absorb things that used to be alive, such as dead plants or dead bugs. That material passes through their system, and when it comes out the other end, it's filled with nutrients that go back into the soil. Decomposers are nature's recyclers. Because we can see them easily with our eyes, insect decomposers, like beetles, roly-poly bugs, spiders, and worms, are called macroorganisms. Other decomposers in the soil, like some types of bacteria and fungi, are so small we often need a microscope to see them. These tiny decomposers are called microorganisms. But all of these different types of decomposers basically do the same job. They break down dead organisms into smaller pieces, which helps to return their nutrients to the soil. And that leads us to two more words we need to define: dirt and soil. As I always tell my students, dirt is something we want to get rid of, something we want to wash off of our hands or our clothing, or that we sweep up off the floor. Soil is filled with living organisms. That means soil not only provides a place for plants to grow, but it's also home to millions of decomposers. The next important term from this lesson is food scraps. When we mention food scraps, we're talking about pieces of food that you might normally think about putting into the trash when you're preparing a meal. And I have a few examples right here. We have the ends of lettuce, the core of a pepper, lemon rinds, zucchini tops, eggshells, tea bags. So all of these are food scraps that you might normally put into the trash. And when that happens, they go into a landfill and create methane gas. And that's bad for our environment and for our planet. So instead, these food scraps, which are delicious food for our decomposers, are heading to the compost. Which means now is probably a good time for another definition, which is composting. Now, there are a few different ways you can compost, and we'll explore those in just a minute. But for this lesson, we need to think about composting as the process of humans helping organic materials decompose to make new soil. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Well, let's take a look at how it works. As I mentioned, there are a variety of different ways to compost. Right now, I'm going to show you the two most common methods that people use at home or at school. One uses a tumbler, the other a bin to which we add worms. But before that, I'm going to have a few friends tell us the things that we need to have in order to compost.
We need food scraps.
Yes, we need food scraps like we discussed earlier. One thing to keep in mind is that when you hear about composting or read about it, you often hear the term green waste. But green doesn't mean the color green. It simply means that things were recently alive and contain moisture, like our food scraps. For example, a lemon rind is yellow, but it would be considered green waste because it was attached to a tree not that long ago. An orange peel isn't green, but it's considered green waste as well because it was recently alive. Okay, what else do we need?
Dead plants and leaves.
Exactly. We need organic material like dead plants and leaves, which are often referred to as our brown materials. Even though they all seem crinkly and dried out, these things still have nutrients that can go back into the soil. What else do we need?
We need some decomposers.
Right, we need decomposers. And now we know that decomposers like bacteria and worms and other insects live in the soil. So we like to add a little bit of soil to our compost. We're doing great so far. What else?
What about air?
Yes, we need air in our compost. If you remember earlier, we talked about how the food scraps that go into the trash often create methane gas, which is a problem for our environment. This happens because those food scraps usually end up in a big pile in the landfill where they get no air. But here in our tumbler, we have holes to let the air in. This helps the food scraps break down in a way that is much better for the earth. Anything else we need?
Patience.
Yes, that's my favorite answer. We need to be patient because composting takes a little time. For example, that tree that falls in the woods, it will take years for it to decompose and turn back into soil. And it will most likely take months for these food scraps to successfully compost. But we're helping keep the earth healthy, so it's definitely worth the wait. Okay, it's time to show you the tumbler process. Now for this lesson, I'm going to put everything into this bin and then take it outside and put it into the tumbler. But when you do this at home or at school, you don't need to do this step. You can put everything directly into the tumbler. Okay, when we put our food scraps into the tumbler, we follow a 3-to-1 ratio. That means for every 1 green we add to the tumbler, we add 3 browns. For example, here we have 1 container of food scraps, which is our green material. And here we have 3 containers of dead leaves and plants, which are our brown materials. This is our 3-to-1 ratio. Having more brown materials than green materials helps absorb the moisture and prevent the tumbler from getting too smelly. And in they go. Next, we add our soil. As we discussed earlier, soil usually contains decomposers like bacteria, fungi, and insects. And those decomposers help break down our green and brown materials and turn them back into healthy soil. And in goes the soil. Okay, the one thing we haven't discussed yet is water. And we want to be careful about how much water we have in our compost. If there's not enough water, the decomposers cannot do their job properly. And if we have too much water, it can slow down the composting process and make the tumbler smelly. So how much water should be in our compost? Well, I like to say, think about the worms. We want the compost to be moist enough so a worm can easily slide around, but not so wet that a worm would drown. The last thing I'm going to do is give it a little stir, just so you can see what it all looks like mixed together. And now I'm going to take this bin outside to our tumbler so you can see how the tumbling action works. Okay, once everything is in the tumbler, we tighten the lid and we start to tumble and mix everything together. Getting everything moving around inside causes friction. And that friction produces heat, which helps the composting happen more quickly. So the more tumbling, the better. And that's it. Another type of composting I want to show you is called vermicomposting. This is the type of composting we do in many of our FoodPrints classrooms. And to show you how it works, we're going to go back outside. Vermicomposting uses a bin like this one, into which we drilled holes in the side. In vermicomposting, we use many of the same materials as we used in the tumbler, like green materials, brown materials, a little soil. But with vermicomposting, we also add a very specific type of decomposer called red wiggler worms. One unique feature of the red wiggler worm is that they're not usually found deep in the soil like other worms. Instead, they like to live on the surface, among things like old leaves or decomposing vegetation, which makes them perfect for this type of composting. One thing to remember about vermicomposting with red wiggler worms is that we need to be careful about what food scraps we add. Certain acidic foods, like tomatoes, pineapples, lemon rinds, and hot peppers, can really irritate the skin of these worms. And just as in the tumbler composting, we don't add meat or cheese because these foods make our compost bins very smelly. Once you have everything inside, place a secure lid on it. If your bin is outside, the lid helps keep your worms from escaping and also keeps other animals from getting in. As I mentioned, these are just two types of composting. Some people on farms compost using an open pile. In some community gardens, they use a 3-bin system. And other composting is done on a large industrial scale where heavy equipment like big tractors are used to turn the compost. All of these composting systems have the same goal in mind: to keep as many organic materials as possible from going into landfills, and instead get those healthy nutrients back into our soil. That helps our environment and it helps us. Because healthy soil means healthy plants, healthy fruits and vegetables, and a healthy you and me. And even if you don't want to set up your own compost system, you can still compost. Many communities now have drop-off sites where you can take your compost. For example, many farmers markets have compost drop-off areas, which make composting really convenient, easy, and fun. So there are many different ways to do your part to keep our soil healthy. Just contact your local government or your school or talk to your friends and neighbors about the best way for you to compost. And that's it for our look at decomposition and composting. Now it's time for you to get started. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.